The quartet drifted into a soft waltz as ivory light spilled across the vineyard, and from the back row, I felt the weight of 100 eyes that weren't looking at me at all. Amelia stood under an arch of roses, her dress catching every candle like a mirror. Her mouth curved into that familiar performance of sweetness that always tasted like salt to me. Nathan didn't turn, but I could sense the tension climbing his shoulders, the way a person braces before the truth arrives. A breeze nudged the curtains, shaking loose petals onto the aisle runner like confetti for the wrong celebration. The pianist lingered on a chord, and the room held its breath, and in that pause, my sister found my face and let a smirk bloom deliberate as a signature. I felt the program soften in my hands where my palms had started to sweat. The minister invited the vows, and Amelia lifted her chin with the poise of someone born for stages and flashbulbs. I knew the moment before it happened, the way you know, a storm by the scent of the air. Before I go on, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if you've ever had to keep quiet to keep the peace tap like, and subscribe so you never have to stand in a room like this feeling alone. My name is Emily, and for most of my life, I have been a quiet woman in noisy rooms, the one who collects coats and half-finished sentences while other people hold the spotlight. I counsel women who are learning to stand again sometimes after years of being made small, and I love that work because it is honest and it doesn't ask for applause. I grew up in a modest neighborhood where summer meant sprinklers and borrowed bikes, where my mother kept a tin of recipes and a firm belief that kindness would come back around if you pushed it out far enough. Amelia came into the world like a sparkler, all glitter and motion, and people told us we were lucky to have each other, because many sisters drift apart. We didn't drift. We braided ourselves into the same photographs, matching dresses, lake weekends, birthday candles, and learned to translate the difference between clapping for someone and being clapped over. By the time we reached our 20s, I had a dependable car with a dented door and a calendar pasted with sticky notes, and Amelia had a calendar of her own that other people rearranged for her. She was the sort of person who could walk into a room and convince it to rearrange itself around her. I went to graduate school at night and learned to listen so carefully that people cried from the relief of it, then discovered how to leave a session's sadness at the door without leaving the person who carried it. My dates were fewer. My friendships softer and steadier, the kind that know your voice on the other end of the phone at midnight. On paper, it looked like harmony, 2 grown women, different lights, 1 house of origin. In practice, it was more like a mirror tilted at the wrong angle, showing me a version of myself I didn't recognize whenever she needed to feel taller. No one outside the family noticed the small cuts, and I was good at treating them like paper-thin inconveniences that didn't require a bandage. Amelia would praise the dress I could barely afford with a smile that ended in, "You make simple things look almost elegant," and I would laugh because it was easier than saying that almost had lodged in my throat. When she landed a client because I introduced her to the right donor, she thanked me with flowers and a post that tagged me as my lucky charm, as if I were an accessory she could slip on for her big nights. Our mother called it sisterly teasing and asked me not to take life so seriously, which is another way of telling a person that their feelings are too heavy to carry in public. I told myself that what mattered was that we were together at holidays, that our family photos were full, that loyalty, especially to blood, made a stronger story than pride. When Nathan arrived in the orbit of my life, it was nothing like a movie, no swoon or dramatic reveal. Just 2 people lingering over paper cups after a fundraiser and discovering we both loved cities at dusk. He talked about benches and bus stops as if they were invitations to belong. I talked about the women who taught me how to hear what isn't said. We kept running into each other while setting up folding chairs or hauling boxes, and then the running into turned into showing up, bringing takeout passing notes that were kind without being clever. I didn't tell Amelia because I've learned that people who claim all the light don't always know what to do with the steady flame. In those months, I convinced myself that a quiet beginning could be a strong foundation if you didn't rush it. I convinced myself of a lot of things. The months before the wedding were a blur of my routine morning coffee with the stubborn French press, late walks home through blocks where the streetlights made the leaves look lacquered lists written in the margins of bills. The surface of my life looked intact the way a pond looks still, until you notice the ripples crossing in opposite directions. I visited my mother on Sundays and listened to her plan Amelia's big day in the same voice she used to plan school bake sales, a tone that made every task sound inevitable. I picked up a dress that made me feel grounded instead of ornamental, and told myself that I would stand in the back clap at the right places and leave without letting the past ride home with me. It is strange what we believe we can manage when we mistake control for courage. Back at the vineyard, the minister invited Vows, and the room leaned forward as if the air itself were interested in the answer. Amelia reached for Nathan's hands, diamonds throwing little suns across the glass, and a camera operator stepped closer, red light blinking. Her gaze climbed over his shoulder, found mine, and held it the way a hand holds a throat. She drew a breath, the kind that announces a performance, and smiled. Then, with the poise of a queen who never expects to be questioned, she opened her mouth and said my name. The moment Amelia shaped my name into a joke, I felt the air drain out of the chapel. Her laughter was light and deliberate, and the guests answered with a ripple of chuckles, polite at first, and then growing louder. I could feel the heat rise into my face, but I forced my mouth into a smile because cameras were trained on us, and appearances mattered to her more than anything. Inside, though, I broke clean in two, and it was as if every time she had ever belittled me was piled onto that single sentence. Nathan's head turned just slightly enough that our eyes met, and I saw something flicker in his expression that unsettled me. It wasn't pride, it wasn't joy, it was something closer to regret. That one glance pulled me backward in time to a rainy night in my apartment more than a year earlier when Amelia and I had our last real conversation. She had accused me of stealing from her, stealing love, stealing chances, stealing the version of herself she thought she deserved. None of it was true, and some of the things she named weren't even hers to lose. But arguing with her had been pointless. Her rage burned too hot to reason with. She hurled words that landed like stones, and I just stood there absorbing it, watching her twist everything until I was the villain in her story. She stormed out the door, slamming so hard the glass rattled, and from that moment, we didn't speak for over a year. When the wedding invitation arrived, I thought for half a second it might mean peace. The envelope was cream-colored, her handwriting looping across the front, elegant as always. My hands shook when I opened it, half hoping for an apology hidden between embossed lines. Instead, the words made my stomach turn. She was marrying Nathan. My Nathan, or at least the man who once felt like mine, even if we had never crossed the line into claiming each other. I sat on my kitchen floor for nearly an hour, staring at that invitation, convincing myself I must have read it wrong. But no, she had chosen him, and worse, she had chosen to flaunt it in front of me. Nathan and I had met years before working side by side at a fundraiser. He wasn't polished, not the type of man Amelia usually went for, but he was thoughtful. He spilled coffee on my sketchbook, made a joke at his own expense, and then spent the rest of the evening talking with me while we folded envelopes and stacked chairs. After that, we kept finding excuses to linger near each other. We never kissed, but the closeness was undeniable. Conversations on my fire escape, little notes he left behind, evenings where silence felt like company instead of absence. He saw me not just the version I tried to present, but the tired and complicated woman I really was. For a while, that was enough. Then Amelia reappeared in my life after another broken engagement. She claimed to have met Nathan by chance in a bookstore, though I never believed her story. Within weeks, she was posting pictures parading him around, as if he were proof she had landed something valuable before I could. She even tagged me in a caption, "Hope you don't mind sharing sis a cruel joke," dressed as playfulness. I confronted Nathan once, quietly asking why he hadn't said anything to me. He lowered his eyes and said he didn't know what we had not really, and he didn't want to ruin it by naming it. I felt my throat close as he spoke, realizing he had handed himself to her, because naming us was harder than losing me. From that moment, I cut myself out of their story. I deleted my social media, buried myself in work, and told myself I was moving on. But betrayal is not something you can turn away from simply because you want to. It lingers, and it finds you in unexpected ways. Ela, my closest friend, sent me a screenshot one evening. No message, just an image. It was Amelia and Nathan standing in front of the Nelson Atkins Museum. Amelia in the red dress she once borrowed from me, Nathan in the suit I had helped him pick out. The caption read, "When he said he needed clarity, I gave him direction." That word clarity hit me like a blade. It had been our word, Nathan's and mine, something we used when we couldn't name the pull between us. To see it used by her was unbearable. I dropped my phone to the floor that night and sat on the cold tile with my knees pulled to my chest. My body shook with the kind of grief that doesn't find sound. Betrayal doesn't always look like violence or loud confrontation. Sometimes it looks like silence, like someone choosing absence when you needed them present. I thought about Amelia, about all the times I had defended her to others, about the hope I carried that one day she might soften. And I thought about Nathan, about the way his absence carved out more space inside me than his presence ever had. The days that followed were a blur of going through motions. I still showed up at the shelter, still listened to women unravel stories heavier than mine, but my own pain sat just under my skin, ready to surface. I stopped answering calls, stopped returning texts, and let myself dissolve into routines that required no joy. People saw me and thought I was fine, but I was unraveling. The final collapse came at a staff meeting when someone asked my opinion and nothing came out. My throat closed, my vision blurred, and before I could stop myself, I was sobbing in front of everyone. I left the room and didn't go back. At home, I stood in front of the mirror and hardly recognized the reflection. My eyes were sunken, my skin pale, my shoulders curled inward. I whispered, "Who are you?" And the silence that followed was terrifying. Without Amelia to define me, without Nathan's half-love, I felt like I was nothing. I called Isla late that night, my voice breaking before I could say the words. She came immediately, no questions asked, just held me while I cried until my breathing slowed. In her arms, I remembered for the first time what it felt like to be seen without judgment or comparison. That was when the truth began to shift inside me. I couldn't keep shrinking, couldn't keep swallowing words and calling it loyalty. I began writing pages of memories, hurts the ways Amelia twisted compliments into cuts, the way Nathan once made me feel safe, only to hand that safety to her. The more I wrote, the clearer the patterns became. I realized how often I had chosen silence, how many times I had let myself be small just to avoid conflict. No more. With trembling hands, I pulled out the RSVP card for the wedding that had been buried in a drawer. I checked attending, not for Amelia, not for Nathan, but for me, because I needed to stand in that room, look them both in the eye, and know I could survive it. Sometimes, the only way to reclaim yourself is to walk into the fire and see if you come out whole. I mailed the card the next morning, the envelope heavy in my palm, as if it carried not just a reply, but a promise to myself. I told no one. I kept it tucked close, knowing the day would come when every buried truth would demand to be spoken. And in that moment, as the mailbox clanged shut, I felt the first flicker of strength I hadn't felt in years. Small, fragile, but mine. I didn't know then that Amelia wasn't finished with me yet, that she would find a way to pull me back into her theater before the vows were spoken. But I had taken the first step, and once you step toward truth, you can't unlearn it. The weeks after mailing that RSVP dragged like stones tied to my ankles. Outwardly, I moved through my routines: coffee in the morning, long shifts at the shelter, the quiet walk home under streetlights. But inside, I was unraveling. I carried my pain like a secret I didn't know how to put down. My phone became a lifeline I both clung to and avoided. Every buzz felt like it might be another photo, another reminder that Amelia was living a life that looked glittering from a distance, while mine felt like ashes. The first sign that my mask was slipping came at the shelter. A resident asked for advice on setting boundaries with her sister, and I opened my mouth to answer, but felt my throat close instead. I excused myself, muttering something about needing water, but really, I just needed air. I stepped outside and leaned against the brick wall, the cold seeping through my sweater. For the first time, I couldn't separate their stories from mine. I was supposed to be the steady one, the listener, the guide. Yet I couldn't even steady myself. At home, my apartment became a cave I retreated into. The plants withered on the windowsill, mail piled by the door, and I let calls go unanswered. I posted a smiling photo here and there because it was easier to pretend than to explain. The truth was, I was suspended between days, caught in a loop where I woke, stared at the ceiling, cried, and went back to bed. Nights were worse. I lay in the dark, replaying memories with Nathan, dissecting every pause, every word, trying to pinpoint the moment I had lost him. Was it that snowy night when we sat in silence too long? Or the morning he lingered at the door and left without looking back? What haunted me most wasn't that Amelia had him. It was the message beneath it. That I wasn't enough. Not bold enough, not dazzling enough, not Amelia enough. I hated myself for believing it, yet the thought wormed its way into everything I touched. Rage lived alongside grief, the two of them pacing like restless animals inside me. Sometimes I wanted to call Amelia and scream to shatter her perfect facade and tell the world what she really was. Other times, I turned the anger inward, blaming myself for ever letting her close, for not being louder, sharper, harder. The breaking point came on a rainy Wednesday. I was at the shelter for a staff meeting, trying to keep my focus on intake forms and policy notes. Someone asked for my input, and I opened my mouth, but no words came. Heat surged through my face, my chest constricted, and suddenly I was sobbing in front of 10 colleagues. The room blurred, the sound of their chairs scraping back felt deafening. I couldn't explain. I just walked out shaking and kept walking until I reached my apartment. That night, I stood in front of my mirror, staring at a version of myself I barely recognized. My posture was curled, my eyes ringed with shadows, my skin pale and tired. I reached up to wipe my tears and whispered, "Who are you?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything Amelia had ever thrown at me. Without her drama, without Nathan's half-love, without the role of being the one who always held everyone else together, I didn't know who I was anymore. I called Isla just after midnight. My voice was broken before I could form the words, but she understood. She was at my door within minutes, her hair pulled into a messy bun, wearing slippers and a hoodie. She didn't try to talk me out of my grief, or patch it with platitudes. She just held me steady and silent until my breathing slowed. At one point, she whispered, "You're not disappearing, Em. You're shedding, and shedding hurts because it means letting go of the belief that if you just keep being good, people will stop hurting you." Her words settled in me like an ember, not blazing, but steady. For the first time, I realized that my silence had been my own undoing. I had confused being quiet with being safe, and being accommodating with being loved. I couldn't keep carrying Amelia's damage or Nathan's absence like they defined me. I needed to give my pain somewhere to go. So I started writing. At first, the words came in ragged bursts, fragments of memory sentences that trailed off half-truths I had never dared to say aloud. I wrote about Amelia's backhanded compliments, about Nathan's notes that once felt like lifelines and later became ghosts. I wrote about the way our mother brushed it all off as sisterly teasing, about how I had trained myself to swallow everything just to keep the peace. My hand cramped, but I kept going page after page until the patterns began to show themselves. I saw how much of my life had been shaped around shrinking, how I had been the quiet background to other people's noise. One evening, I pulled open the drawer where Amelia's invitation had been resting and took out the RSVP card. My fingers shook as I checked the box. Attending. Not for her, not for Nathan, but for me. I needed to prove to myself that I could stand in that room, face them both, and not crumble. That my worth wasn't something they could erase. I slipped the card into an envelope, sealed it, and carried it to the mailbox. The clang of metal when I let it go echoed like a promise. For the next few days, I tried to believe that choice would bring relief. I cleaned my apartment, bought new sheets, threw away mugs that reminded me of nights Nathan had stayed too late. I even signed up for a yoga class, thinking movement might loosen the grief stuck inside me. But the emptiness followed me. Healing doesn't come just because you declare you want it. It comes when you survive the collapse enough times to start building again. I told myself I was moving on, but really, I was circling the same pain. I went on impulsive dates that ended with me crying in the bathroom or excusing myself mid-meal. I dyed my hair only to dye it back, bought new clothes that still hung heavy on me. Nothing stuck, nothing healed. It wasn't until another storm hit one that had nothing to do with Nathan or Amelia that I finally admitted how broken I was. A woman at the shelter, someone I had grown close to, relapsed and disappeared overnight. No call, no note, just gone. I sat on the bathroom floor at work, sobbing so hard I gave myself a headache. I wasn't just crying for her. I was crying for every piece of myself I had been pretending wasn't shattered. That night, for the first time in years, I searched for a therapist. Not an article, not a self-help podcast, but a real counselor who could hold me accountable for more than surface strength. Her name was Dr. Nadia Ellis, and she would become the first person who asked me to stop carrying damage that wasn't mine. But I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I had taken another step toward something I couldn't yet name. As I lay in bed that night, my journal open on the nightstand, I felt the faintest trace of calm. Not forgiveness, not closure, but clarity. And clarity, even in its smallest form, felt like survival. I didn't know what Amelia would do next, or how she would find a way to pull me back into her world. But I knew I couldn't keep being silent, and that truth alone would change everything. Therapy with Dr. Nadia began on a Tuesday afternoon in a small office tucked inside a brick building near Midtown. The walls were painted in muted tones, softened by string lights, and bookshelves filled with worn spines. On my first visit, I sat stiff in the armchair, clutching a tissue I didn't use and told her I didn't know how to stop carrying other people's pain. She listened without interrupting, her expression calm, and finally said, "Then let's figure out why you keep picking it up." Her words cracked something open in me, not in a violent way, but like a door shifting quietly on old hinges. Week after week, I came back. At first, I rambled, wanting to sound as if I was only there for fine-tuning, like someone who already knew how to heal and just needed a push. But Nadia saw straight through me. She had a way of letting silence sit between us until I filled it with the truths I'd been avoiding. I spoke about Amelia, the rivalry disguised as love, the compliments that always carried a sting, the way I felt like a prop in her play. I spoke about Nathan, about how his absence hurt more than his choice, how he had never given me clarity, only silence. But the real shift came when I stopped talking about them and began talking about myself. Who was I without their shadows? What did I believe about love-worth and being chosen? That was when Nadia said, "Sometimes the cost of peace is the version of yourself that kept begging for it." Those sessions gave me the strength to do something I had never managed before. I cut off Amelia completely. I blocked her number, muted her online, even deleted the old voicemails I'd been holding on to as proof that maybe one day she would soften. It felt like sawing off a limb, but also like taking the first clean breath after months underwater. For a short time, I thought I was finally moving toward peace. Then Amelia found a new way to pull me back in. One morning, I opened my email and saw her name sitting bold in my inbox. The subject line read, "Bridesmaid dress sizes need ASAP." My hands trembled as I clicked it open. Inside was a PDF of dress options, a note demanding my measurements by Friday, and not a single word of apology or acknowledgement of the silence between us. It read as though nothing had ever happened, as though I were still a piece of her performance. I stared at the screen for a long time, the old reflex stirring in me, the instinct to be polite, to go along, to keep the peace. But then Nadia's words came back steady as a heartbeat, and I typed 2 words in reply. "I'm not attending!" Then I pressed block. For a moment, I felt powerful. But 2 days later, Isla called, her voice tight with anger. "She posted about you," she said. My chest clenched. What did she say? Isla hesitated before answering. "She wrote that you were too emotionally unstable to be part of her bridal party, that she was disappointed but not surprised." I felt heat rush to my face, shame wrapping around me like a second skin. For a few seconds, it felt like the old wound had split open again. But this time, I didn't collapse. I didn't cry. Instead, something inside me hardened into resolve. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I realized that Amelia wasn't the only villain in my life. I was too. I had been the one silencing myself, convincing myself that being good meant being safe, that swallowing my voice was the same as protecting it. I had been complicit in my own erasure. Rage burned not just at her, but at me, and I decided I wasn't going to live that way anymore. I began rebuilding my life with deliberate choices, not declarations. I got serious about therapy, showing up every week, no matter how drained I felt. I reached out to old friends I had neglected during my self-imposed isolation, inviting them for coffee or long walks in the park. I applied for a trauma counseling certification I had put off for years, and when the acceptance letter came, I pinned it to my fridge as a reminder that I could choose growth over paralysis. My apartment changed with me. I cleared away furniture that held memories of nights waiting for calls that never came. I painted the walls in warm tones, swapped out sharp lines for softer textures, and lit candles that smelled like pine and firewood instead of the sterile ones I had burned during my lowest days. I even replaced my kitchen table, the one Nathan had once helped me assemble, with a new one I built myself. It wobbled a little, but it was mine, and that made it beautiful. Work shifted too. I started teaching a weekly workshop at the shelter on emotional regulation. I didn't know if anyone would show up at first, but the room filled week after week. Women wrote in journals, shared stories, and practiced breathing exercises while I guided them. One of them, a woman named Karen, pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "This is the first room I've ever felt safe crying in." Her words nearly brought me to tears because it meant that my pain had been reshaped into something useful, something that could hold space for others. During that season, I also met June, a retired professor who volunteered at the shelter twice a week. She wore oversized sweaters and carried herself with the kind of authority that comes from surviving storms. One afternoon, after we finished stacking boxes together, she looked at me and said, "You walk like someone who just remembered she has wings." I laughed, telling her I felt more like someone dragging a suitcase full of bricks. She smiled, eyes knowing. Same thing. Wings take time to remember. June became an anchor for me. On Thursdays, we had tea together, and she spoke about boundaries, betrayal, and the difference between loneliness and solitude. She told me, "You don't owe anyone your silence, especially not the ones who handed you pain and called it love." Her words stayed with me long after the cups were empty. Before one of our meetings, she leaned in and added, "When you walk into that wedding, make sure you know why you're there. Not for revenge, not for answers, but for truth." That night, sitting by the glow of my new terracotta walls, I realized she was right. For too long, I had been performing survival, polishing my pain, so it looked acceptable from the outside. But true healing was not about appearances. It was about sitting with the discomfort, calling it by its name, and letting it teach me where I ended and where others began. The changes were small at first, walking in the mornings without my phone, journaling before bed, saying no without justifying myself. But slowly, these choices began to shape a version of me that felt stronger, steadier, and less dependent on anyone else's approval. I bought a bright dress and wore it on an ordinary Tuesday. I dabbed perfume on my wrists before going to the grocery store. I even got a small tattoo on the inside of my wrist, a crescent moon, to remind myself that healing, like the moon, comes in phases. Even with these shifts, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. The wedding loomed like a shadow, its date circled on my calendar. Some mornings I woke from dreams where Nathan was apologizing, and tears slipped down my cheeks before I was fully awake. Some nights I missed the sister I wished Amelia could be the version of her I had always hoped existed. But grief, I was learning, wasn't something to outgrow. It was something to carry differently. I kept showing up to therapy, to the shelter, to my own life. I kept breathing through the urge to shrink back into silence, and slowly the sadness loosened its grip. It was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had begun to find peace, not the fragile kind that shatters at the first sign of conflict, but the steady kind that comes from truth. I didn't know what Amelia would try next, or how Nathan would look at me when the day finally came. But I knew one thing with certainty. I wasn't walking into that vineyard as the sister she thought she had broken. I was walking in as the woman she had underestimated. And that realization changed everything. The weeks leading up to the wedding felt different than the hollow months that had come before. I wasn't rushing toward some sudden transformation, but instead making deliberate choices that added up quietly, piece by piece. I woke early and walked without my phone, listening to the sound of my footsteps and the birds in the trees. I wrote before bed, even on nights when the words felt jagged. I learned to say no without softening it with an excuse. These weren't grand gestures, but they became a rhythm I could lean on. I started dressing in a way that pleased me, not as armor, but as expression. Bright colors that had once felt too bold found their way back into my closet. I wore perfume when I went to the grocery store, not because anyone would notice, but because I enjoyed it. The apartment reflected those changes too. I painted the walls a warm terracotta, replaced the cold grays I had once mistaken for sophistication. Books I hadn't touched in years lined the shelves, and candles that smelled of cedar and smoke burned in the evenings. Every shift, however small, felt like a reminder that my life was mine to shape. The certification coursework kept me busy, and for the first time in months, I felt excitement returning. The modules were challenging, filled with research and late-night reading, but they lit something inside me that I thought had gone dim. At the shelter, I shared what I was learning, and soon, I began leading small workshops on emotional regulation. I expected empty seats, but women showed up, filling the circle with quiet strength. They wrote in journals, practiced breathing, and shared stories. One woman, Karen, pulled me aside after class and said, "This is the first room I've ever felt safe crying in." Her words nearly undid me. It was proof that the storm I had survived was shaping something larger than myself. Life had a way of testing me just when I thought I was steady. That test came in the form of Eli. He arrived at the shelter as a guest instructor, a yoga teacher with a background in trauma-informed care. He was tall, soft-spoken, with a calmness that didn't feel forced. His eyes reminded me of autumn leaves, warm and steady. After his session, we lingered to talk about the nervous system and how the body holds memory. Our conversation was easy, not rushed or performative, and I found myself looking forward to seeing him again. Coffee followed, then dinner, and eventually evenings where we sat under string lights on the patio of a small jazz cafe. He never pressed for more than I was ready to give. When silences came, he didn't rush to fill them. One night, he looked at me and said, "You have a way of sitting in your truth without making it anyone else's burden." His words startled me. They felt like recognition, not expectation, and I realized how rare that was. I didn't tumble into love with him. Instead, I walked toward it slowly, one choice at a time. Even with Eli's presence, the wedding loomed like a shadow on the calendar. Isla filled me in gently, telling me the details she thought I should know. Amelia's bridal party had grown to 15, with plans for horses and chandeliers strung through the vineyard. She had chosen a theme she called ethereal royalty, which sounded like her grand, excessive, and carefully curated. She told people I had declined to come because I was too overwhelmed to witness her joy. The lie stung, not because it was true, but because it was crafted to look polished and believable. Still, I didn't respond. Growth. I reminded myself wasn't about fighting every lie. It was about choosing which truths to stand in. In quiet moments, I prepared for that day. I chose my dress with intention, a deep green silk that rested off the shoulders, timeless and commanding without being loud. It was the kind of dress that spoke for itself, a dress that said, I was done shrinking. Eli offered to come with me, but I told him I needed to go alone. He didn't argue. He just nodded and said, I'll be here when you get back. That simple trust meant more than grand declarations ever could. The night before the wedding, I sat by my window, moonlight spilling across the floorboards. My journal lay open, pages filled with months of pain, clarity, and rebuilding. I lit a candle and whispered a promise to myself. No more pretending, no more shrinking, no more molding myself into something easier for others to swallow. Tomorrow wasn't about Amelia. It wasn't about Nathan. It was about truth and the strength I had found in claiming it. Still, the sadness hadn't left me entirely. Some mornings, I woke from dreams where Nathan was apologizing, and tears slipped silently down my cheeks. Other nights, I missed the sister I had hoped Amelia could become. Grief didn't vanish just because I had chosen myself. Healing. I was learning meant carrying sadness without letting it control me. I could hold both truths, that I still felt the ache and that I was no longer defined by it. When I thought of Amelia, I no longer felt the old desperation for her approval. What I felt was recognition. She was who she had always been, and I was finally becoming who I was meant to be. The power she once held over me had come from my silence, and I wasn't silent anymore. The morning of the wedding, I woke early calm in a way I hadn't expected. I dressed slowly, savoring each step. The green silk slid over my skin like a second layer of resolve. I fastened a simple necklace, slipped into my heels, and caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw a woman who wasn't waiting to be chosen. I saw someone who had already chosen herself. As I left my apartment, the air was cool and steady. The drive to the vineyard stretched out in silence, my hands resting steady on the wheel. The landscape rolled by golden with late summer, and I thought about how much life had changed in just a year. I wasn't the woman who hid from conflict anymore. I wasn't the sister who clapped quietly in the background. I was walking into that vineyard not as the broken version she wanted me to be, but as the woman she had underestimated. I didn't know exactly what would happen when I stepped onto those grounds. I didn't know how Amelia would react to seeing me there, or how Nathan would look at me after everything. But as the rows of vines came into view and the white tents gleamed against the horizon, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever happened next, I was ready to face it head-on. The vineyard shimmered in late afternoon light, every detail polished for a storybook scene. White tents swayed with the breeze, roses curled around trellises, and the string quartet played as if the music itself had been rehearsed for months. Guests in jewel-toned gowns and dark suits moved with glasses in hand, their laughter low and effortless. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the hem of my deep green silk dress, my heels pressing into the gravel with a sound that cut sharper than I expected. Heads turned, but I didn't meet their eyes. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to stand in my truth. Inside the reception hall, the chandeliers glittered like frozen constellations, candles glowing in tall glass pillars. At the center of it all was Amelia, spinning in her lace gown with practiced ease, Nathan beside her in a tailored suit. The crowd gravitated toward her like always, orbiting her as if she were the only light in the room. But Nathan's eyes were searching, restless. When they found me across the space, the noise seemed to pause for half a beat. His expression shifted, regret etched into his features, and for the first time in years, Amelia faltered. Her smirk slipped just slightly as her gaze followed his. She froze when she saw me. I moved past the crowd, steady toward the open-air patio, where the last of the sunlight painted the vines in gold. The air outside was cooler, quieter, carrying the scent of soil and roses. I stood by the railing, the fabric of my dress brushing against the stone, and listened to the footsteps approach behind me. I didn't turn. I already knew it was her. She stopped just close enough for her perfume to drift between us. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her voice cut through the stillness. "You made it after all." I kept my gaze on the vineyard. "I was always going to come." Her tone sharpened. "Funny. You seem so fragile. I didn't think you'd have the strength." I turned slowly, just enough for our eyes to meet. She looked flawless, as she always did, but there was tension in her face, a tightness under the shine. "I'm not here for a scene, Emily," she said quickly. "This is my day." I let her words settle before answering. "I know, and I have no intention of stealing it." Her eyes narrowed. Then why are you here after everything I studied her, every pearl in her crown, every layer of lace, every line she had drawn between us over the years? And then I saw what I had come for. Underneath the grandeur was fear. The fear that I had survived her cruelty and stepped into a clarity she couldn't touch. I drew a slow breath and spoke the sentence I had carried for months. You don't know how to exist without hurting me, and that terrifies you. Her lips parted, but no words came. In that silence, I watched her mask fracture. The myth she had built where she was the star, and I was the shadow, shuddered like glass under strain. Her hands trembled against the lace, her chin lifting as if posture alone could hold her together. You always made me feel small. I continued, my voice steady, even when I was the only one clapping for you. She blinked, and I pressed on each word, a release I had never allowed myself before. You didn't take Nathan because you loved him. You took him because you needed to prove you could. That one landed. She looked away toward the hall where the guests moved behind glass, her carefully curated world waiting for her performance. But her silence told me the truth, that she heard me, and she couldn't deny it. The light shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting her in shadow, and me in the last streak of gold. I stepped slightly forward, letting her see what I had become. Not bitter, not broken, just free. She saw it. Not just the dress or the posture, but the woman standing in front of her, no longer afraid. Her voice broke when she asked, You think you're better than me now? No, I said softly. I think I'm finally not afraid of you. The words hung between us heavier than any accusation. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I turned and walked away, the sound of my heels steady against the stone. I didn't need to raise my voice or seek an audience. Power didn't demand attention. It simply existed. Inside, Nathan waited near the edge of the hall. His eyes followed me, his expression torn, the weight of regret pressing across his face. I moved past him without stopping, but then his voice reached me. Emily! I paused, not turning, just listening. His tone was softer now, uncertain. I never stopped thinking about you. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the wound open just wide enough to remember its cost. Then I turned my head slightly and answered, calm and final. Then you should have stayed when it mattered. His face fell, but I didn't wait for a reply. I stepped through the doorway into the last light of the evening, free in a way I hadn't been in years. The vineyard behind me buzzed with laughter and music again, the performance resuming without me. Ahead, the gravel path stretched out toward the car waiting at the edge of the lot. My heels crunched against the stones, each step carrying me farther from the weight of their world. The sun had slipped low, and the horizon glowed with the kind of light that only appears after storms. For the first time, I realized the breaking point wasn't about Amelia or Nathan. It was about me, about finally speaking the truths I had buried, about watching her facade collapse, about leaving without looking back. I didn't need an audience to witness it. The only witness I needed was myself. As I reached the car, the cool air wrapped around me like a quiet shield. My hands no longer trembled. My voice no longer ached with unsaid words. I had done what I came to do, and nothing Amelia or Nathan carried could undo it. I slid into the seat, closed the door, and let the silence wash over me. The vineyard lights flickered in the distance, a world I no longer belonged to. The engine turned, the tires shifted, and the gravel faded behind me. Ahead was only the open road lined with fields waiting in the dusk. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how Amelia's world would bend under the weight of truth. But as the headlights cut through the darkness, I felt certain of one thing: I had broken the cycle, and the life waiting for me would no longer be lived in her shadow. The morning after the wedding was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in years. Sunlight slipped through my curtains, soft and steady, filling the room with a stillness that didn't demand anything from me. The air carried the scent of coffee brewing in my French press, and when I stepped onto the fire escape wrapped in a sweater, the city stretched beneath me, indifferent and calm. Life had not paused for Amelia's performance or Nathan's regret, and for the first time, I felt at peace with that. I returned to my journal, its pages heavy with months of grief and clarity. At the back, I wrote words that came without hesitation. You are not broken. You are the whole story. For once, the truth I wrote didn't sting. It felt like recognition. That night, I pulled out the box of keepsakes I had hidden away. Cards, photos, little fragments of a life I thought I had to keep tethered. One by one, I let them go, not with rage, but with grace. I burned a candle that smelled of firewood, and I chose to keep only a single photograph of myself as a child, smiling on the front steps of our old house, with arms wrapped around a stray dog. I looked fearless in that picture, and I placed it by the door so I would see her every time I left. At the shelter, the women welcomed me back with open arms. Their hugs, their stories, their laughter pulled me into a rhythm that reminded me why I had chosen this work. One young woman, Bree, pressed a folded piece of paper into my hands after a session. I wrote a poem, she said shyly. I unfolded it, the handwriting careful and deliberate. The last line read, "She didn't speak, but somehow the room still listened." My throat tightened as I whispered, "That's beautiful." It was more than that. It was truth. It was proof that strength could exist quietly and still be heard. On my walk home that evening, I ran into Eli outside a bookstore. He carried a stack of worn novels and a reusable cup, his smile easy as always. "Hey, stranger," he said. I smiled back. "Hey, you." We walked side by side, our steps unhurried, the silence between us comfortable. When we reached my building, he handed me one of the books. "No pressure," he said. "Just something to read when you want words that don't ask anything of you." I thanked him, touched by the simplicity of the gesture. Before leaving, he kissed my cheek lightly. No promises, no demands, just presence. Later, curled up by the window with that book in my lap, I read a line that stopped me. Peace isn't something you find, it's something you return to. I closed my eyes, letting those words settle. That was what I had been doing all along, returning. Not to what was broken, not to what Amelia had taken or Nathan had left behind, but to the part of myself that had always been there, waiting beneath the noise. Each day afterward, the evidence of change grew stronger. I noticed I no longer flinched when someone spoke of betrayal or abandonment. My shoulders didn't curl inward when I heard laughter that might once have felt like mockery. The sadness still visited, but it no longer controlled me. It arrived as a shadow and left as a reminder. The women at the shelter noticed too. One of them told me, "You listen like someone who walked through a storm and came back with a map." That stayed with me. When I thought of Amelia, I no longer pictured the smirk she wore at the altar or the cruel captions she wrote for the world to see. I saw a woman trapped in her own performance, desperate to keep her crown even as it slipped. And Nathan, I remembered the look in his eyes when he whispered he had never stopped thinking about me. I didn't feel longing anymore. I felt clarity. His regret was his to carry. Mine had been released the moment I walked away. Justice didn't come as a dramatic downfall. It came quietly in the way their world shrank without me in it. Amelia's lies lost their power because I stopped reacting. Nathan's silence no longer defined me because I had found my own voice. Their stage went on, but I was no longer a prop. That was the real reversal. One evening, Isla and I sat on her porch with mugs of tea. She looked at me for a long time before saying, "You're different. Not harder, not colder, just free." I smiled, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "I finally stopped asking for a seat at a table that was never built for me," I told her. She nodded, her eyes shining. "That's the justice she'll never escape, seeing you live without her control." As summer faded, I realized I had been carrying myself differently. My steps felt grounded, my voice steady, my laughter unforced. The fear that once shadowed me had lifted, replaced by a calm strength I hadn't thought possible. That was Amelia's undoing. Not my words at the vineyard, not even Nathan's fractured expression, but the simple fact that I was free, and she could do nothing to change that. I didn't need her collapse to validate me. I had my own life rebuilt with intention, shaped by choices that were mine alone. And as I sat one evening in my terracotta-painted apartment, a candle flickering on the table, I built myself. I knew the final chapter was still ahead. Not theirs, mine. Because true justice wasn't in watching Amelia's crown slip or Nathan's regrets deepen. It was in living a life they could no longer touch. And that was the story I was determined to write next. The weeks after the wedding slipped into a rhythm that surprised me. There were no fireworks, no dramatic announcements about what had happened. Amelia went back to her curated life, Nathan back to his quiet regret, and I went back to mine. But something had shifted in ways that couldn't be undone. Their stage had kept spinning, yet for the first time I wasn't on it. That alone was justice enough. Each morning I returned to small rituals that had become anchors. My French press, the notebook by my bedside, walks that began before the city stirred awake. I no longer checked for updates about Amelia's life, no longer waited for signs from Nathan. The silence between us became a gift rather than a punishment. When I passed my own reflection, I saw a woman who had learned to stop begging for a seat at someone else's table and had built her own instead. At the shelter, the women noticed before I fully did. They told me my presence felt steadier, that I listened without carrying their stories on my shoulders. One afternoon, a resident said, "You don't flinch when people talk about pain anymore. You look like someone who walked through the storm and found her way back." Her words echoed what I had begun to feel, a sense that my scars weren't a weight, but a map. Eli remained a quiet presence. We shared coffee books evenings on the patio when the air was warm enough to sit outside. He never rushed me or asked for more than I could give. With him, I learned what it meant to feel safe without performing. For the first time, love didn't feel like a conquest or a test. It felt like home, gentle, steady, and without condition. Isla and I grew closer too. She had seen me through the worst of it, and one evening, as we sat with mugs of tea on her porch, she said, "You know, the real victory isn't what you said to her. It's that you're living free now." I nodded, realizing she was right. Amelia's crown had slipped. Nathan's regrets had spoken for themselves, but none of that mattered as much as the life I had rebuilt, one honest piece at a time. Looking back, I see that justice didn't arrive as public humiliation or a dramatic downfall. It came quietly, in the way my silence no longer protected anyone but myself, in the way their lies lost power once I stopped feeding them. It came in every step I took that wasn't weighed down by fear. My sister had once believed she needed to keep me small to feel large, and Nathan had once chosen absence instead of clarity. But I had learned the hardest lesson of all, that my worth was never theirs to decide. Now, when I glance at the photograph by my door, the one of me as a fearless little girl holding a dog on our front steps, I smile. I see her in me again. She had been there all along, waiting for me to stop shrinking and to remember. That's the person I walk out the door with every day, the one who is whole, unapologetic, and free. If there is one truth this journey gave me, it's that dignity is not handed to you. It's reclaimed, sometimes piece by piece, sometimes through fire. And once you take it back, no one can strip it from you again. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this story spoke most to you. Share your reflections in the comments. And if these stories bring you comfort, stay with us here. More journeys of truth, justice, and quiet resilience are yet to come.